It all started when our school district in Denver, Colorado, banned all forms of nonverbal communication, after claiming students were using hand gestures and body language to coordinate drug deals. My younger sister Emma had severe social anxiety and selective mutism, meaning she literally couldn't speak in most social situations, especially at school. At home with our family, she was chatty and funny, but the moment she stepped into that building, her voice just shut down completely. Before the ban, Emma had developed an elaborate system with her best friend Zoe, where they used subtle gestures, facial expressions, and written notes to communicate throughout the day. Emma would tap her pencil twice to signal she needed help, or Zoe would brush her hair behind her ear to ask if Emma was okay. It wasn't sign language exactly, but it was their lifeline that kept Emma functional in a school environment that terrified her into silence. The new policy banned all intentional gestures, note passing, and what they called conspiratorial body language. Teachers were instructed to confiscate any written communication between students and report repeated nonverbal coordination to the administration. Emma's carefully constructed support system vanished overnight, leaving her completely isolated in a building full of people she couldn't talk to. Without her communication methods, Emma started having panic attacks during classes. She'd sit frozen at her desk when teachers called on her, unable to speak, but also unable to signal for help. Her grades plummeted because she couldn't ask questions, couldn't participate in group work, and couldn't even tell teachers when she didn't understand assignments. The school counselor suggested she was being deliberately defiant and threatened to move her to alternative education if her attitude didn't improve. I tried teaching Emma to be more assertive, to push through her anxiety and just speak up, but anyone who understood selective mutism knew it wasn't a choice. Her throat would literally close up, her breathing would become shallow, and words just wouldn't come, no matter how hard she tried. During lunch, I'd watch her sit alone at a table, staring at her food while other kids chatted around her, completely cut off from any social interaction. Her psychologist, Dr. Martinez, explained that selective mutism wasn't shyness or stubbornness. It was a legitimate anxiety disorder that made speaking in certain environments physically impossible. She'd been working with Emma for 2 years, and they'd made incredible progress using gradual exposure therapy combined with alternative communication methods. The school's new policy had undone months of therapeutic work in a matter of weeks. Dr. Martinez wrote multiple letters to the school explaining Emma's condition and requesting accommodation under her 504 plan. She outlined how the communication ban was actively harmful to Emma's mental health and academic progress. The principal responded that exceptions couldn't be made because it would undermine the policy's effectiveness in preventing drug coordination, as if my sister's anxiety disorder was some elaborate cover for dealing narcotics. The situation got worse when Emma's English teacher, Mrs. Peterson, decided to help by putting Emma on the spot constantly. She'd call on Emma first in every class, hold up lessons waiting for verbal responses, and assign presentations that required speaking in front of the entire class. Mrs. Peterson told my parents she was trying to break Emma out of her shell, and that coddling would only make the problem worse. Emma started having nightmares about school and would wake up crying, begging to stay home. Her hands shook constantly. She lost weight from stress-induced nausea, and she developed a nervous habit of pulling out her eyelashes when she felt trapped. I'd find her in her room after school, just staring at the wall with tears streaming down her face, unable to even explain what had happened that day. During chemistry lab, our teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, divided us into pairs for an experiment involving concentrated acids and bases. Emma got partnered with Jake Morrison, a kid who talked constantly but never listened. The experiment required precise measurements and careful timing. One person would measure while the other recorded data, then they'd switch roles for the second part. Mr. Rodriguez explained that communication was crucial for safety, but reminded everyone about the school's nonverbal policy. He said students needed to use clear verbal instruction only, no gestures or written notes allowed during lab work. Emma went pale when she heard this because she literally couldn't give verbal instructions, and Jake wasn't the type to notice or care about her anxiety. They started with Emma measuring the first chemical while Jake was supposed to record the amounts. But Jake was busy talking to his friends at the next table about weekend plans, completely ignoring Emma's measurements. She tried clearing her throat to get his attention, but that wasn't allowed under the nonverbal policy. She couldn't tap his arm or point at the notebook because those were banned gestures. Emma stood there holding the beaker, watching Jake laugh with his friends while the chemical reaction she'd started was heating up faster than expected. She needed him to record the temperature readings every 30 seconds, but he had no idea the experiment was even happening. Other students around them were talking normally with their partners, following the procedure step by step, while Emma's was falling apart in silence. The mixture started bubbling more aggressively, and Emma could see it was going to overflow the beaker. She needed to tell Jake to grab the overflow container, but her voice was completely locked. She tried making a small gesture toward the container, but Mrs. Harris, the assistant teacher, saw her and held up a warning finger about the gesture policy. Emma's hands were shaking as she held the bubbling beaker, knowing she needed immediate help but unable to ask for it. The chemical reaction was accelerating beyond what the procedure had described, and she could smell something sharp and acrid that made her eyes water. Other students were starting to notice, backing away from her station as the smell got stronger. Jake finally turned around just as the beaker started smoking heavily, releasing toxic fumes that made everyone in the area start coughing. He yelled, "What did you do?" at Emma, who just stood there frozen with tears in her eyes, still holding the overflowing beaker while acid dripped onto the lab table, eating through the surface. The smoke alarm went off, and Mr. Rodriguez came running with the emergency neutralizer, shouting for everyone to evacuate while he dealt with the spill. The acid had created a small but dangerous cloud of chlorine gas that sent 6 students to the nurse with breathing problems and burned through Emma's lab coat, leaving red marks on her arm. As everyone filed out of the building, I found Emma sitting on the grass outside, hyperventilating and rocking back and forth. She had chemical burns on her forearm and was having a full panic attack, but she still couldn't speak to tell the paramedics what had happened. I tried to explain her condition to them, but they needed information about which chemicals she'd been exposed to, and she was the only one who knew exactly what had gone wrong. The fire department arrived and went into the building with breathing equipment to neutralize the remaining gas. The paramedics were getting frustrated because Emma couldn't answer their questions about her symptoms or what she'd inhaled. I grabbed her notebook from her backpack and helped her write down what had happened, but they said they needed verbal confirmation for their report. The next morning, Principal Davidson called us both to his office, along with Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Harris. They had Emma's lab notebook open on the desk, showing her neat measurements and observations from the first part of the experiment, then chaos and scribbled notes about Jake not paying attention and the reaction going wrong. Principal Davidson started lecturing about following safety procedures and the importance of clear communication in dangerous situations. He kept emphasizing how Emma should have spoken up immediately when she noticed the problem, completely ignoring the fact that speaking up was literally impossible for her. Mr. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, but didn't defend Emma when the principal blamed her for the accident. Mrs. Harris chimed in that she'd seen Emma trying to use hand gestures during the lab, which violated the nonverbal communication policy even during an emergency. She pulled out her phone and showed a photo she'd taken of Emma reaching toward the overflow container, calling it evidence of policy violation in a dangerous situation. I watched Emma shrink further into her chair with each accusation, her hands trembling as the adults around her treated her anxiety disorder like a behavioral choice. Principal Davidson announced she was suspended for 3 days for failure to follow safety protocols and attempted policy violation during laboratory work. The suspension letter listed her silence as uncooperative behavior and her gesture toward the container as deliberate defiance. That evening, our parents called Dr. Martinez to explain what had happened. She immediately scheduled an emergency session and spent 2 hours documenting how the school's policy had directly caused a dangerous situation by preventing Emma from communicating during a crisis. She wrote a detailed report explaining how punishing selective mutism was like suspending a student for having asthma attacks. Dr. Martinez called the principal directly and tried to explain selective mutism as a documented disability protected under federal law. Principal Davidson responded that the school couldn't make exceptions for individual students because it would create loopholes that drug dealers could exploit. He suggested Emma might be better served at a specialized school if she couldn't function in a normal educational environment. The next day, Jake's parents showed up at our house, demanding to know why Emma had sabotaged their son's grade by not communicating properly during the lab. They claimed Emma had deliberately caused the accident to get out of doing the work and that her silence was manipulative, attention-seeking behavior. They threatened to sue our family for the medical bills from Jake's mild smoke inhalation. I started researching selective mutism online and found horror stories from other families dealing with schools that didn't understand the condition. Parents described children who'd been suspended for defiance, held back grades for not participating, and subjected to increasingly aggressive interventions that made their anxiety worse. The pattern was always the same: schools treating a recognized disability as behavioral problems. Emma's suspension meant she missed 3 days of classes in her weakest subjects, putting her further behind academically. When she returned, Peterson announced that Emma would need to make up her missed presentation time by giving 2 presentations to compensate. Emma had another panic attack right there in English class, hyperventilating so badly the nurse called an ambulance. The emergency room doctor who examined Emma documented severe anxiety symptoms and asked detailed questions about what was triggering these attacks. When we explained the school situation, he shook his head and muttered something about educators who didn't understand mental health. He wrote a letter stating Emma needed immediate academic accommodations to prevent further medical crises. 2 days later, during our family's grocery shopping trip, we ran into Officer Michael Torres from the local police station. He recognized Emma from the chemistry incident report and asked how she was recovering from her chemical exposure. When I mentioned her suspension for not speaking during the emergency, his eyebrows went up, and he asked us to explain the whole situation. Officer Torres listened carefully as our parents described the nonverbal communication ban and Emma's selective mutism. He took notes when Dr. Martinez's reports were mentioned and asked for contact information so he could understand the medical aspects better. He seemed genuinely confused about why a school would punish a student for having a recognized anxiety disorder. That same afternoon, Officer Torres called Principal Davidson to ask questions about the incident report. According to our later conversation, he wanted to understand why Emma had been disciplined for a disability-related behavior during a safety emergency. Principal Davidson apparently spent 20 minutes explaining the drug coordination concerns and the importance of consistent policy enforcement. Officer Torres asked if the school had consulted with any drug enforcement experts before implementing the policy, or if they had evidence of actual drug coordination happening through gestures. When Principal Davidson couldn't provide any documentation, Officer Torres suggested the policy might be discriminating against students with communication disabilities in violation of federal law. The conversation ended with Principal Davidson becoming defensive about the school's authority to maintain safety and order. He told Officer Torres that police shouldn't interfere with educational disciplinary decisions unless actual crimes were involved. Officer Torres replied that denying disability accommodations was actually a federal crime under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Later that week, Emma had her regular therapy session with Dr. Martinez, who was documenting the regression in Emma's progress since the school policy began. Emma's selective mutism had spread from just school to other public places, and she was having panic attacks about situations she'd handled fine before. Dr. Martinez was considering recommending hospitalization if Emma's anxiety continued escalating. Dr. Martinez scheduled a meeting with our parents and Principal Davidson to formally request immediate accommodation under Emma's existing 504 plan. She brought a stack of research about selective mutism, federal disability law requirements, and documentation of how the current policy was causing measurable harm to Emma's mental and physical health. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning in the principal's office. Dr. Martinez presented her case methodically, explaining how selective mutism worked and why Emma literally couldn't speak in school situations. She showed brain scans from research studies demonstrating the neurological differences that made verbal communication impossible for people with this condition during anxiety episodes. Principal Davidson listened politely, but kept returning to his main point about policy consistency and security concerns. He insisted that making exceptions would signal to other students that rules could be broken by claiming disabilities. When Dr. Martinez pointed out that selective mutism was a recognized medical condition, not a claimed disability, he shrugged and said the school couldn't verify every student's medical claims. The meeting ended with Principal Davidson agreeing to review Emma's case, but warning that any accommodations would be minimal and wouldn't include exemptions from verbal participation requirements. Dr. Martinez left visibly frustrated, telling our parents she'd never encountered such deliberate ignorance about disability rights in an educational setting. That weekend, Emma had her worst panic attack yet after dreaming about giving presentations in Mrs. Peterson's class. She woke up unable to breathe, clawing at her throat like something was choking her. We called Dr. Martinez's emergency line at 3 a.m., and she talked Emma through breathing exercises over the phone while we drove to the hospital. The ER physician who examined Emma documented severe anxiety-induced physical symptoms and recommended immediate intervention to address the triggering environment. He wrote in his report that continuing to expose Emma to situations that caused this level of distress could result in lasting psychological damage and potentially dangerous physical episodes. Monday morning, our parents decided Emma wouldn't return to school until the accommodation issues were resolved. They submitted a formal complaint to the district's special education office, citing violations of Emma's 504 plan and requesting immediate implementation of communication alternatives during emergencies and regular classwork. The district's response came 2 days later in the form of a letter threatening truancy charges if Emma didn't return to school immediately. The letter stated that medical excuses wouldn't be accepted indefinitely and that Emma needed to adjust her behavior to meet the school's requirements rather than expecting special treatment. Our parents hired an educational advocate named Sarah Chen, who specialized in disability rights cases. Sarah reviewed all the documentation from Dr. Martinez, the hospital reports, and the school's correspondence. She immediately filed a formal ADA complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, citing discrimination and failure to provide appropriate accommodations. Sarah also sent a letter to Principal Davidson explaining that selective mutism was protected under federal disability law and that denying accommodations could result in a federal lawsuit and loss of district funding. She requested an immediate meeting to develop appropriate accommodations that would allow Emma to communicate safely during emergencies and participate in classroom activities. The response from the district's legal department came within 24 hours, offering a compromise that would allow Emma to use written notes for emergency situations only, but maintaining that all regular classroom participation must be verbal. Sarah rejected this as inadequate, pointing out that selective mutism didn't differentiate between types of speaking situations. Meanwhile, I was doing my own research and discovered that our district had received federal grants specifically for supporting students with communication disabilities. The grant applications, which were public records, included promises to provide appropriate accommodations and maintain inclusive environments for all students, regardless of communication methods. I printed out copies of the grant documents and highlighted the sections where the district had committed to supporting nonverbal communication methods for students with documented needs. Sarah was thrilled with this evidence and added it to our growing file of documentation, showing the district's hypocrisy and potential fraud in accepting disability-focused funding while discriminating against disabled students. Emma's absence from school was now into its second week, and she was starting to worry about falling behind academically. Dr. Martinez arranged for a tutor who specialized in working with students with selective mutism, but Emma needed to be in an actual classroom environment to work on her anxiety management skills. The tutor, Mrs. Kim, was amazed at how articulate and intelligent Emma was in the safe environment of our home. She worked with Emma on gradual exposure techniques and alternative communication methods that could help bridge the gap between Emma's home voice and school silence. Mrs. Kim had worked with the dozens of students with selective mutism and said Emma's case was being handled terribly by the school. Officer Torres called our house that Thursday evening to follow up on the chemistry incident. He'd been researching selective mutism and ADA requirements, and he wanted to understand if the school's disciplinary actions constituted discrimination. When our dad explained Emma's continued absence from school due to anxiety, Officer Torres asked if he could speak with Dr. Martinez directly. The conversation between Officer Torres and Dr. Martinez lasted over an hour, with the doctor explaining the medical and legal aspects of Emma's condition. Officer Torres was particularly interested in whether the school's refusal to accommodate Emma's disability created a pattern of discrimination that might affect other students with similar conditions. Dr. Martinez mentioned that she had 3 other patients in the same school district who were struggling with similar issues since the nonverbal communication ban began. All were students with various communication disabilities who'd previously been successful with appropriate accommodations, but were now failing or avoiding school entirely. Officer Torres asked for contact information for these other families, explaining that if there was a pattern of discrimination affecting multiple disabled students, it might warrant a broader investigation. Dr. Martinez couldn't provide patient information directly, but offered to facilitate contact with parents who were willing to discuss their experiences. By Friday, Officer Torres had spoken with 2 other families dealing with similar situations. One had a son with autism who used picture cards to communicate, and another had a daughter with cerebral palsy who relied on a communication device that the school had banned as disruptive technology. All 3 families were considering legal action against the district. Officer Torres compiled his findings into a report documenting potential civil rights violations and submitted it to the district attorney's office for review. He explained that while individual accommodation disputes were usually handled through education channels, a systematic pattern of disability discrimination could constitute criminal civil rights violations under federal law. The weekend brought an unexpected development when Emma's story was shared on social media by another parent whose child attended our school. The post included photos of Emma's chemical burns and excerpts from Dr. Martinez's reports about the psychological damage caused by the school's policies. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times with comments from parents, teachers, and disability advocates expressing outrage. Local news picked up the story Monday morning, with a reporter calling our house to request an interview about disability discrimination in schools. Our parents were hesitant about media attention, but Sarah Chen advised that public pressure might be the fastest way to force the district to change its harmful policies. The news story aired Tuesday evening, featuring interviews with Dr. Martinez about selective mutism, Sarah Chen about disability rights, and a brief statement from our parents about Emma's experience. The district declined to comment beyond saying they were reviewing policies to ensure compliance with all applicable laws. Wednesday morning brought a call from the district's superintendent, Dr. Rebecca Williams, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss Emma's situation. Sarah Chen insisted on attending as our advocate, and the meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at the district office. Dr. Williams assured our parents that the district was committed to finding a solution that would work for everyone. Emma was cautiously optimistic about returning to school, but terrified that nothing would really change. Dr. Martinez recommended a gradual transition plan where Emma would start with shortened days and slowly build up her tolerance for the school environment while having guaranteed access to alternative communication methods during the adjustment period. The meeting with Superintendent Williams included Principal Davidson, the district's special education director, and their legal counsel. Sarah Chen presented our case methodically, showing how the blanket ban on nonverbal communication violated multiple federal laws when applied to students with documented disabilities requiring alternative communication methods. The district's legal counsel admitted they hadn't fully considered the ADA implications when implementing the policy and suggested modifications that would allow accommodations for students with documented medical needs. Principal Davidson looked uncomfortable, but didn't object when the superintendent agreed to create exception procedures for disability-related communication needs. The agreement reached that day included immediate reinstatement of Emma's communication accommodations, training for all staff on selective mutism and communication disabilities, and a review of discipline policies to ensure they didn't discriminate against students with disabilities. Emma would return to school the following Monday with a detailed accommodation plan and regular check-ins with the school counselor who actually understood her condition. However, the implementation wasn't as smooth as the agreement promised. Several teachers continued treating Emma's silence as defiance, and some students whose parents supported the original policy began bullying Emma and calling her a faker who was getting special treatment. Mrs. Peterson was particularly hostile, making snide comments about convenient disabilities and assigning Emma extra written work to compensate for not participating verbally. Emma's anxiety remained high, and she continued having panic attacks, though less frequently than during the complete communication ban. Dr. Martinez worked with the school counselor to develop intervention strategies, but changing years of trauma-based associations with the school environment was a slow process that required patience and consistency from all the adults involved. 3 weeks after Emma returned to school, Jake Morrison's parents filed a complaint claiming Emma's accommodations gave her unfair advantages over other students. They argued that allowing written communication for one student while banning it for others created an unequal playing field that discriminated against neurotypical children who had to follow the rules. The complaint triggered another round of meetings and legal consultations, with the district's counsel explaining again and again that ADA accommodations weren't advantages, but necessary adjustments to provide equal access to education for students with disabilities. Jake's parents eventually dropped their complaint after consulting with their own attorney, who explained disability law basics. Officer Torres continued following Emma's case and submitted additional reports documenting the district's initial resistance to providing legally required accommodations. His investigation had expanded to include a review of how the district handled disability-related discipline across all schools, revealing a pattern of treating disability symptoms as behavioral problems. The broader investigation led to a federal compliance review of the entire school district, with investigators from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights conducting interviews with families, staff, and students about disability accommodation practices. The review took 6 months and resulted in a consent decree requiring comprehensive policy changes and ongoing federal monitoring. Emma's individual case became part of a larger class action lawsuit representing dozens of families affected by discriminatory policies in the district. Sarah Chen joined a team of civil rights attorneys pursuing damages for educational harm and demanding systemic changes to protect future students with communication disabilities. The legal process stretched over 2 years, but it resulted in significant victories for disability rights in education. The district paid substantial settlements to affected families and implemented comprehensive staff training on disability accommodation requirements. Emma's story became a case study used in teacher preparation programs to illustrate the importance of understanding communication disabilities. By senior year, Emma had made remarkable progress in managing her selective mutism, though she still struggled in high-stress situations and large group settings. She'd found her voice through writing and became editor of the school newspaper, where she could communicate her thoughts and experiences without the pressure of verbal presentation. Her college application essays about overcoming communication barriers and advocating for disability rights earned her acceptance to several prestigious universities with strong disability support services. Looking back, the weirdest thing about getting in trouble with the police wasn't that it happened, but that it took a law enforcement officer to recognize what educators should have understood from the beginning: that punishing someone for having a disability isn't discipline, it's discrimination. Officer Torres became an unlikely ally in our fight for Emma's rights, and his willingness to investigate potential civil rights violations helped transform a traumatic experience into lasting change for students with communication disabilities throughout our district. The experience taught our family that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or principals' offices, but in the daily work of helping people understand that different doesn't mean deficient, and that true safety in schools comes from creating environments where every student can communicate, learn, and thrive according to their individual needs and abilities. The aftermath of our legal victory continued for months after Emma graduated. Officer Torres was promoted to detective and started specializing in civil rights cases involving educational discrimination. He testified at congressional hearings about the need for better training for school resource officers and administrators regarding disability rights and proper accommodation procedures. Dr. Martinez published research papers based on Emma's case and several others, documenting the severe psychological harm caused when schools deny communication accommodations to students with selective mutism and related conditions. Her work influenced new clinical guidelines for treating anxiety disorders in educational settings, and became required reading in graduate programs for school psychologists. Sarah Chen used our case as the foundation for establishing a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the rights of students with communication disabilities. The organization provides free legal assistance to families facing similar discrimination and has successfully challenged dozens of school policies that violated federal disability law across multiple states. Emma's recovery wasn't linear or simple. Even with accommodations in place, she struggled with trust issues regarding authority figures and continued having anxiety about school environments well into her college years. She worked with Dr. Martinez throughout high school and into her freshman year of college, slowly rebuilding her confidence in situations where she needed to advocate for herself. The bullying from other students whose parents opposed her accommodations escalated during her junior year, with kids deliberately triggering her anxiety by making loud noises or creating chaotic situations where she couldn't process what was happening. Some parents organized a petition demanding Emma be transferred to a different school because her accommodations were disruptive to their children's learning experience. Principal Davidson was eventually transferred to a different district after the Federal Compliance Review found multiple violations of disability law under his leadership. His replacement, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, had extensive experience working with students with communication disabilities and immediately implemented systemic changes to prevent future discrimination incidents. The chemistry department underwent major reforms after our case revealed that emergency procedures didn't account for students who couldn't communicate verbally during crises. New protocols required visual emergency signals, buddy systems for students with communication needs, and alternative methods for reporting safety concerns during lab work. Mrs. Peterson faced disciplinary action for her continued harassment of Emma and other students with disabilities. She was required to complete extensive training on selective mutism and communication disorders, though she remained hostile and eventually took early retirement rather than adapt her teaching methods to be more inclusive. Emma's friendship with Zoe became stronger throughout the ordeal, as Zoe learned to be an effective advocate and ally. Zoe testified at school board meetings about witnessing Emma's struggles, and became president of the Disability Awareness Club they founded together. Their friendship demonstrated how peer support could be just as important as professional accommodations. The media attention around Emma's case sparked similar investigations in neighboring school districts, revealing that discriminatory communication policies were more widespread than anyone had realized. A state-level task force was formed to review and standardize accommodation procedures, with Emma and our family serving as advisors on the committee. Jake Morrison's attitude toward Emma changed dramatically after witnessing the severity of her panic attacks and learning about selective mutism from mandatory sensitivity training. He wrote Emma a formal apology letter and became one of her supporters, often defending her when other students made ignorant comments about her disability. The chemical burns on Emma's arm healed physically, but the psychological scars from the incident took years to fade. She developed a phobia of laboratory settings and had to work with an occupational therapist to gradually overcome her fear of chemistry-related activities. The trauma of being blamed for an accident caused by the school's discriminatory policies added layers of complexity to her therapy. Our family's relationship with other parents in the community became strained, as some saw us as troublemakers who were making unreasonable demands. Others became strong allies after learning about selective mutism and recognizing similar struggles in their own children. The polarization forced us to find new social circles with families who understood disability rights. The financial cost of fighting the discrimination was enormous, even with Sarah Chen's help. Legal fees, medical expenses, private tutoring, and therapy costs stretched our family budget to its limits. The eventual settlement helped recover some expenses, but the emotional and financial toll of advocating for Emma's rights was something we hadn't anticipated when the crisis began. Emma's academic performance improved significantly once proper accommodations were in place, but catching up from the lost learning during the worst period of discrimination required intensive tutoring and summer school programs. Her GPA recovered enough for college admission, but the gap in her transcript from the suspended and missed school days remained a permanent reminder of the injustice. The case attracted attention from national disability rights organizations, and Emma was invited to speak at conferences about her experience. Initially too anxious to present publicly, she eventually found her voice through written presentations that were read by advocates, then graduated to pre-recorded video testimonials, and finally to live speaking engagements with communication supports. Officer Torres's investigation uncovered documentation showing that Principal Davidson had implemented the nonverbal communication ban specifically after observing deaf students using sign language in the hallways. Internal emails revealed his personal discomfort with any form of communication he couldn't understand, suggesting the policy was motivated by prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. The school district's insurance company ultimately paid out over $2 million in settlements to our family and the other affected families, making it one of the largest disability discrimination payouts in the state's history. The financial impact forced the district to take disability compliance much more seriously and invest in comprehensive staff training programs. Emma's case study was incorporated into police academy training curricula, teaching officers how to recognize potential civil rights violations in educational settings and understand the difference between behavioral problems and disability-related struggles. Officer Torres became a frequent instructor in these programs, using Emma's story to illustrate effective advocacy. The Federal Office for Civil Rights Investigation revealed that our district had a pattern of mishandling disability accommodations across multiple schools and grade levels. The consent decree required ongoing monitoring for 5 years, with regular audits of accommodation procedures and mandatory reporting of any student complaints related to disability discrimination. Dr. Martinez's treatment notes from Emma's case became part of a longitudinal study tracking the long-term effects of educational trauma on students with communication disabilities. The research helped establish new standards for measuring psychological harm in discrimination cases and influenced policy recommendations at the federal level. Emma's story inspired other students with hidden disabilities to come forward and request appropriate accommodations. The Disability Awareness Club she and Zoe founded grew from 2 members to over 50, creating a supportive community for students with various conditions who had previously suffered in silence. The chemistry lab where Emma's accident occurred was completely renovated with new safety equipment specifically designed to accommodate students with different communication needs. Visual alarm systems, emergency communication boards, and modified evacuation procedures ensured that future students wouldn't face the same dangerous situation Emma had endured. Mrs. Peterson's hostile treatment of Emma led to additional investigations that uncovered her pattern of discriminating against other students with learning differences and disabilities. Several families came forward with similar complaints, resulting in a separate lawsuit that ended her teaching career and led to policy changes about how districts handle complaints against staff members. The local news station that first covered Emma's story won a regional journalism award for their reporting on disability rights in education. The attention helped other families in similar situations realize they weren't alone and encouraged them to seek help from advocacy organizations and legal resources. Emma's selective mutism never completely disappeared, but she developed effective coping strategies and learned to advocate for herself in various environments. In college, she majored in communications and disability studies, with plans to become an advocate for other students facing similar challenges in educational settings. The ripple effects of our legal victory continued expanding as other states began reviewing their own policies regarding communication accommodations in schools. Emma's case was cited in legislative hearings and used as an example of why stronger oversight of disability compliance was necessary at the local level. Officer Torres eventually left law enforcement to work full-time as a civil rights investigator, specializing in cases where institutions violated the rights of people with disabilities. He credited Emma's case with opening his eyes to the widespread discrimination that often went unrecognized by people who didn't understand disability rights. Years later, when Emma was in graduate school studying disability law, she received a letter from a student in another state who had faced similar discrimination. The student credited Emma's public advocacy with giving her the courage to fight back against her own school's discriminatory policies, showing how our family's traumatic experience had created positive change for others. The weirdest part about our trouble with the police was that it ultimately led to the most important relationship we developed during the entire ordeal. Officer Torres became not just an ally, but a friend who understood the intersection between law enforcement and disability rights in ways that few people in either field seemed to grasp. Emma's transformation from a silenced, traumatized student to a confident disability rights advocate took nearly a decade. But the journey taught our entire family about resilience, advocacy, and the power of refusing to accept discrimination as inevitable. The police investigation that initially seemed like another obstacle became the key to holding the school district accountable and creating systemic change. Looking back on the entire experience, the most profound lesson was that justice isn't just about winning legal battles. It's about changing systems so that other families don't have to endure the same struggles. Emma's story became bigger than just her individual case. It became a catalyst for protecting the rights of students with communication disabilities across our entire state. The investigation that started with one officer questioning why a school would punish a student for having a disability ultimately exposed institutional prejudices that had affected countless students over many years. Officer Torres's willingness to dig deeper and challenge educational authorities created a precedent for how law enforcement should respond to potential civil rights violations in schools. Emma graduated summa cum laude from college and was accepted to several top law schools, where she planned to specialize in disability rights and educational law. Her personal statement about overcoming selective mutism and advocating for accommodation rights helped her earn a full scholarship to continue her legal education. Our family's relationship with the school district remained complicated even after the legal settlement, as some administrators continued to view us as adversaries rather than partners in creating inclusive policies. However, the new leadership gradually embraced the changes and began seeking our input on disability-related initiatives. The nonprofit organization Sarah Chen founded, using our case as inspiration, has since helped over 300 families navigate similar discrimination cases, with a success rate of over 90% in obtaining appropriate accommodations. The organization's legal clinic provides free services to families who couldn't otherwise afford to challenge discriminatory school policies. Emma's public speaking about her experience grew more confident over time, and she began presenting at national conferences on disability rights in education. Her presentations always emphasized that selective mutism wasn't a choice or character flaw, but a legitimate neurological condition that required understanding and accommodation rather than punishment and shame. The federal monitoring of our school district revealed ongoing compliance issues that extended far beyond communication disabilities, including failures to accommodate students with mobility impairments, learning differences, and sensory processing disorders. The comprehensive reform process took 3 years, but ultimately created one of the most inclusive educational environments in the state. Officer Torres's career change inspired other law enforcement officers to specialize in civil rights investigations, leading to the creation of a regional task force focused on institutional discrimination. The task force used training materials developed from Emma's case to educate officers about recognizing and investigating disability-related civil rights violations. Emma's relationship with her former chemistry partner Jake Morrison evolved into an unlikely friendship, built on his genuine remorse and desire to understand disability issues. Jake became an ally who spoke at school assemblies about the importance of being aware of classmates who might need different forms of support or communication. The psychological impact of fighting institutional discrimination lasted long after the legal victory, affecting our entire family's trust in educational systems and authority figures. Our parents developed hypervigilance about Emma's school experiences and became advocates not just for her, but for other students they noticed struggling with similar issues. The settlement money from the lawsuit allowed Emma to attend college without student loan debt, but it couldn't compensate for the years of trauma and educational disruption she had experienced. Dr. Martinez continued working with Emma through college, helping her process the complex emotions around having her disability weaponized against her by the very institution meant to educate and protect her. Emma's case became a landmark precedent cited in over 50 subsequent disability discrimination lawsuits across the country. Legal scholars wrote extensively about the intersection of emergency safety protocols and disability accommodations, using our experience to argue for more comprehensive policies that didn't force students to choose between safety and communication access. The chemistry teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, eventually reached out to our family years later to apologize for not standing up for Emma during the initial disciplinary meeting. He had been afraid of losing his job if he contradicted the administration, but watching Emma's suffering had haunted him. He became a vocal advocate for inclusive emergency procedures and testified in several similar cases. Officer Torres's investigation methods became a model for other departments dealing with educational discrimination complaints. He developed training protocols that taught officers to recognize the signs of institutional bias and understand when disciplinary actions might actually constitute civil rights violations requiring criminal investigation rather than just administrative review. The school board eventually adopted a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy named the Emma Martinez Protocol that required immediate accommodation reviews anytime a student with disabilities faced disciplinary action. The protocol mandated that disability-related behaviors could never be punished and that all emergency procedures must include alternative communication methods. Emma's selective mutism evolved rather than disappeared as she matured. She found her voice in writing, advocacy, and one-on-one conversations, though large group settings and high-stress situations continued to trigger her communication difficulties. Her college Disability Services Office provided accommodations that allowed her to demonstrate her knowledge through alternative methods when verbal participation was required. The ripple effects of our case extended to teacher education programs, which began including mandatory coursework on disability rights and communication disorders. Emma guest lectured at several universities, sharing her story with future educators to help them understand the difference between behavioral problems and disability-related struggles that required support rather than punishment. Dr. Martinez's research on educational trauma in students with communication disabilities received national recognition and led to changes in clinical practice guidelines. Her work demonstrated that forcing students to communicate in ways that were neurologically impossible for them could cause lasting psychological damage, equivalent to other forms of institutional abuse. The Federal Office for Civil Rights used our case as a training example for investigators learning to identify systemic discrimination in educational settings. The case study highlighted how seemingly neutral policies could have discriminatory impacts on students with disabilities, and why intention wasn't required to establish civil rights violations. Emma's story attracted international attention from disability rights advocates in other countries dealing with similar educational discrimination issues. She corresponded with families in Canada, the UK, and Australia who were fighting for communication accommodations, sharing strategies, and providing moral support across cultural and legal boundaries. The transformation in our school district's culture took several years, but eventually created an environment where students with various disabilities felt safer advocating for their needs. The Disability Awareness Club Emma founded became a permanent fixture that provided peer support and educated the broader student body about inclusion and acceptance. Mrs. Peterson's early retirement opened the door for hiring Miss Rachel Thompson, an English teacher with specialized training in communication disorders who transformed the department's approach to student participation. Ms. Thompson developed innovative methods for assessing student understanding that didn't rely solely on verbal contributions, benefiting all students regardless of communication styles. The insurance company that covered the school district's liability began requiring disability rights training as a condition of coverage, creating economic incentives for other districts to proactively address accommodation issues rather than waiting for complaints. This market-based approach to compliance had broader impacts than legal mandates alone. Emma's college experience was dramatically different from high school, as university disability services were more sophisticated and legally compliant. She thrived in an environment where her accommodation needs were met without stigma, and where professors understood that diverse communication methods enriched rather than disrupted the learning environment. The local police department created a specialized unit for civil rights investigations, partly as a result of Officer Torres's work on Emma's case. The unit handled complaints involving discrimination in housing, employment, and education, with officers trained to recognize when institutional policies violated federal civil rights laws. Emma's friendship with Zoe deepened through their shared advocacy work and continued into adulthood as both pursued careers in disability rights. Zoe became a special education teacher specializing in students with communication disorders, while Emma focused on legal advocacy and policy reform at the systemic level. The chemical spill incident led to industry-wide reviews of laboratory safety protocols in educational settings, with particular attention to ensuring that emergency procedures were accessible to students with various disabilities. New standards required visual and tactile emergency signals in addition to auditory warnings, benefiting students with hearing impairments and sensory processing differences. Sarah Chen's nonprofit organization expanded to include a legal defense fund that provided grants to families fighting disability discrimination cases who couldn't afford private attorneys. The fund was partially supported by settlements from successful cases, creating a sustainable model for protecting other families' rights. Emma's transformation from trauma victim to disability rights advocate inspired other young people with similar experiences to find their voices and share their stories. A network of student advocates emerged, supported by the nonprofit organization and connected through social media platforms that facilitated peer support and resource sharing. The congressional hearings where Officer Torres testified led to proposed federal legislation requiring standardized disability rights training for all school administrators and law enforcement officers who work in educational settings. The bill, informally known as the Emma's Law, gained bipartisan support and passed the House before stalling in the Senate. Dr. Martinez's longitudinal study of Emma and other students affected by educational discrimination revealed patterns of resilience and recovery that challenged assumptions about the permanent effects of institutional trauma. Her research showed that appropriate support and advocacy could help students not only recover, but develop stronger self-advocacy skills than their non-traumatized peers. Emma's case study was incorporated into medical school curricula for students specializing in adolescent psychiatry and developmental pediatrics. The interdisciplinary approach emphasized the importance of understanding educational environments as significant factors in mental health treatment and recovery for young people with disabilities. The settlement funds also supported the creation of a scholarship program for students with communication disabilities pursuing higher education. Emma served on the selection committee, helping to identify young people who showed promise as future advocates and leaders in the disability rights movement. Officer Torres's transition to civil rights investigation work eventually led to his appointment as a federal compliance officer with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. His law enforcement background provided unique insights into the intersection of criminal and civil rights enforcement in educational discrimination cases. Emma's public speaking evolved to include testimony before state legislatures, considering disability rights legislation, and presentations at international conferences on inclusive education. Her articulate advocacy challenged stereotypes about communication disabilities and demonstrated the intellectual capabilities that had been hidden by discriminatory school policies. The long-term health effects of Emma's educational trauma required ongoing monitoring and treatment well into her 20s. Dr. Martinez documented how chronic stress from discrimination had affected Emma's neurological development and required specialized interventions to address anxiety patterns that had become deeply ingrained during her formative years. The school district's transformation became a model studied by researchers, examining how institutions could change discriminatory cultures through comprehensive policy reform, staff training, and ongoing accountability measures. The district began hosting visits from other school systems, seeking to implement similar inclusive practices. Emma's relationship with Jake Morrison evolved into a meaningful friendship that challenged both of their assumptions about disability and accountability. Jake's genuine effort to understand and make amends became part of Emma's healing process and demonstrated how former adversaries could become allies through education and empathy. The media coverage of Emma's case continued for years through follow-up stories documenting her college success, the school district's improvements, and the broader impact of the legal precedent on other families. The sustained attention kept disability rights in education visible in public discourse and encouraged other families to come forward with their own experiences. The federal monitoring of the school district revealed additional systemic issues that extended beyond disability discrimination to include racial and economic inequalities in disciplinary practices. The comprehensive reform process addressed multiple forms of institutional bias simultaneously, creating a more equitable educational environment for all students. Emma's undergraduate thesis examined the intersection of disability rights and educational policy, focusing on how legal frameworks could be strengthened to prevent the type of discrimination she had experienced. Her research contributed to policy recommendations that influenced state-level legislation in several jurisdictions. The nonprofit organization founded by Sarah Chen eventually expanded internationally, providing resources and support to families dealing with educational discrimination in countries with different legal systems but similar challenges. Emma served as a youth advisory board member, helping to develop programs specifically designed for adolescent advocates. Officer Torres's investigation techniques were adopted by other agencies dealing with institutional discrimination complaints, leading to more effective enforcement of civil rights laws in educational settings. His approach emphasized the importance of understanding disability as a civil rights issue rather than simply an accommodation matter. Emma's recovery process included learning to trust authority figures again, which required careful selection of professors, employers, and healthcare providers who demonstrated genuine understanding of disability rights. Dr. Martinez helped Emma develop criteria for identifying supportive environments and advocating effectively for her needs in new situations. The chemical burns on Emma's arm eventually faded to barely visible scars, but she chose not to have them completely removed, as a reminder of what she had survived and overcome. The scars became part of her story in advocacy presentations, illustrating the physical and emotional costs of institutional discrimination. Emma's graduate school application essay about her experience with selective mutism and educational discrimination helped her gain admission to every law school where she applied. Admissions committees were impressed by her resilience, advocacy experience, and commitment to using her legal education to protect other students with disabilities. The precedent set by our case influenced dozens of subsequent settlements and court decisions, creating a body of law that made it increasingly difficult for schools to ignore or dismiss disability-related accommodation requests. Legal advocates reported that districts were more likely to negotiate reasonable solutions rather than risk expensive litigation and negative publicity. Emma's story became required reading in social work programs, special education courses, and disability studies curricula across multiple universities. Students analyzed the case to understand systemic barriers faced by people with disabilities and develop skills for effective advocacy and support. The transformation in Emma's confidence and self-advocacy skills was gradual but profound. By her senior year of college, she was leading workshops for other students with disabilities, serving as a mentor for high school students facing similar challenges, and speaking at professional conferences about the importance of peer support in recovery from institutional trauma. Looking back on the entire experience 10 years later, Emma reflected that the worst thing that happened to her had also led to the most meaningful work of her life. The discrimination and trauma had been devastating, but fighting back had revealed strengths she never knew she possessed, and opened doors to advocacy opportunities that gave her suffering purpose and meaning. The weirdest thing about getting in trouble with the police remained that it was Officer Torres's investigation that ultimately validated what our family had known all along, that Emma's silence wasn't defiance or manipulation, but a genuine disability that deserved accommodation rather than punishment. His willingness to look beyond surface appearances and question institutional narratives made all the difference in our fight for justice. The legacy of Emma's case continued expanding as new generations of educators, law enforcement officers, and disability advocates learned from her experience. Each person who heard her story and changed their approach to working with people with communication disabilities multiplied the impact of our family's struggle, creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond what we could have imagined when the crisis first began.